In the summer of 2014, a relatively unknown group swept across Iraq and Syria, capturing territory the size of Great Britain. The immediate response from international media and think tanks was to label them an apocalyptic death cult. They chalked the group's rapid expansion up to irrational religious fanaticism. Treating this organization as a theological aberration is a methodological failure. It strips them of their political agency and ignores the complex historical machinery that produced them. To understand the mechanics of this violence, we have to put down the theology texts and pick up the tools of political archaeology. We need to excavate the layers of statecraft, war, and globalization that laid the groundwork for the movement. Scholar Muhammad Mahmoud Old Mohammedo details this exact approach in A Theory of ISIS. He argues that the organization functions as a highly calculated, modern, and rational political actor. Mohammedo identifies three structural forces that collided to birth this entity: the failure of post-colonial Arab state building, decades of Western military intervention, and a highly specific operational matrix designed years earlier by al-Qaeda. The extreme violence we see today is the result of a 30-year evolution in which non-state actors completely redesigned the way war is fought. Historically, political violence was almost entirely local. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, insurgent groups directed their attacks at specific national or colonial governments to extract concrete political concessions. Early post-colonial militant groups in the Middle East and North Africa followed this exact playbook. They aimed their operations directly at their own authoritarian governments, what they called the near enemy. These regions had spent decades pursuing pan-Arabism and nationalism, ideologies that promised genuine independence and prosperity, but ultimately failed to deliver on either front. When domestic opposition emerged in response to these failures, military-led regimes in countries like Egypt, Syria, and Algeria responded with devastating force. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, state intelligence and police units systematically crushed local militant organizations. The prisons filled up. The crackdowns exacted a heavy psychological toll on the surviving militants, who realized that domestic rebellion against these deeply entrenched regimes was a zero-sum game they could not win from the inside. Facing the systemic failure of their local state-building ambitions, radical militants were forced into geographic exile. That displacement set the stage for a massive strategic mutation. The opportunity for that mutation arrived in December 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The arrival of a global superpower provided exiled militants with a new, unifying battlefield. Militants from across the Arab world converged on the region. They established a logistical hub in Pakistan, the Maktab al-Khadamat, to process these new Arab-Afghan fighters and channel them into the resistance. Among these early organizers was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. He recognized that traditional underground militancy was useless here. Fighting a superpower required a completely different operational scale. He was soon joined by figures like the Egyptian surgeon Ayman al-Zawahiri. Men who had survived the brutal prisons of their home countries brought a hardened, uncompromising rigidity to the movement's intellectual core. Together, they executed a critical pivot, the militarization of Islamism. They stripped away the focus on domestic social services and political preaching, concentrating entirely on armed, irregular warfare. This network evolved beyond isolated cells of domestic rebels. They usurped the authority and the hardware usually reserved for sovereign states, ultimately bleeding a military superpower into withdrawal. The Soviet defeat provided a dangerous proof of concept. The victory suggested that the monopoly on force held by superpowers was vulnerable to a sufficiently organized irregular network. The Afghan conflict forged isolated, defeated domestic rebels into a confident network capable of challenging global powers. This confident network now looked for its next objective. To project their violence globally, they required a new geopolitical justification. For bin Laden, the initial psychological trigger occurred during the 1982 Lebanon War. He watched Western-backed forces deploy heavy military infrastructure into Arab cities, severely influencing his focus on American foreign policy. The decisive turning point came in August 1990 with the Gulf War. The massive deployment of United States military forces directly onto the Arabian Peninsula confirmed the group's shifting priorities. This diagram outlines al-Qaeda's strategic pivot. They officially abandoned the objective of overthrowing local regimes. The operational vector flipped 180 degrees to strike directly at Western hegemony, moving from the near enemy to the far enemy. This initiated the transnationalization of violence. By expanding their reach across borders, they embedded their operations into the very infrastructure of the modern world. Al-Qaeda actively hijacked the tools of the 1990s globalized economy. They used international banking networks, the commercial aviation sector, and satellite communication systems to project privatized military force anywhere on Earth. In doing so, they broke the centuries-old Westphalian monopoly on violence. They proved that a non-state actor, without a defined territory, could organize, fund, and wage an international war. The environment mutated again following the 2003 United States invasion of Iraq, and later the 2011 Syrian civil war. The total collapse of local state order in these regions served as the incubator for the next phase. ISIS was incubated directly inside al-Qaeda's operational network in Iraq. But as the geopolitical landscape fractured, the leadership of this new faction actively chose to rewrite the formula. Al-Qaeda had relied on an elusive, highly decentralized hit-and-run structure. For the new generation taking power in Iraq and Syria, remaining in the shadows was no longer sufficient. ISIS shifted toward aggressive, over-territorial state building. They claimed cities, extracted taxes, and managed infrastructure, moving from a hidden insurgency to acting as a conquering authority in the Levant. Simultaneously, they introduced a second structural shift, the democratization of responsibility. They decentralized the authorization of violence down to the individual level. They weaponized postmodernity, deploying highly professionalized, cognitively optimized media to outsource their campaign. This strategy bypassed traditional network recruitment. They beamed an open-source insurgency directly to digital consumers worldwide, providing individuals with the aesthetic and the ideological framing to act entirely on their own. ISIS became a highly adaptable hybrid. Locally, they governed and fought like a traditional state. Globally, they operated as a borderless, do-it-yourself digital insurgency. This chart illustrates a concept in international relations known as the boomerang effect. Notice the flow of the lines. They represent military interventions moving from the imperial center out into the developing periphery. For over a century, the global order operated on the assumption that military force and systemic control flowed in only one direction, outward from the West to the rest of the world. ISIS utilized the tools of modern globalization to reverse this flow. They gathered up the kinetic energy of decades of instability and shipped the violence directly back to the sender. This dynamic materialized physically as a series of hyper-visible, devastating attacks embedded in the heart of Western capitals throughout the 2010s. The immediate reaction from Western democracies to this beamed violence is profound internal securitization. Military patrols are routinely deployed into the domestic metropolitan sphere. This creates a self-sustaining cycle. External intervention drives state collapse in the periphery, which incubates non-state terror networks, which in turn drives mass surveillance and creeping authoritarianism back in the Western center. Until the global security apparatus stops treating these organizations as ancient religious anomalies and recognizes them as highly rational symptoms of a deeply asymmetrical post-colonial order, this matrix of transnational violence will continue